Cheetie, and Sheri. The topic of the panel that we're having right now is the taste of memory. And I'd love to just start off by hearing about one really important memory about food. And how does that memory shape how you think about food and culture?
Thank you. So nice to be here. My first food memory is with my grandmother. Kind of cliche, but it's very personal to me. In India, we lived in Chandigarh, and we would get milk delivered every day, and it was probably raw milk. Don't tell the authorities. And we would boil the milk every day, and my grandma would always, boil the last half a little bit extra, and that koya that gets stuck to the bottom of the pot, she would scrape that and always put some sugar on it and put it directly in my mouth. I was the only kid of 3 that hung out in the kitchen, and I'm so glad I did.
I'm from the mountains of Western North Carolina, a place that's having a hard day, by the way, but I grew up in a family that maintained an enormous garden, nearly a half acre for a family of 4. And so my first food memory is literally going to the garden with a grandmother. Also, I was raised by a woman who was a magical cook. Now, of course, I did not know at the moment I was being raised on a rich cultural history. We were just eating supper. But I can remember going to the garden with them and harvesting things, and often sitting with the family to peel apples, string beans, do those sorts of things. And what I realize now is that all of that food literally has a taste of place. It came from the mountains, which remains one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. So I think that without knowing it, that really set my mouth to food that is of a place and of a people.
Those are amazing stories. I wonder, I throw you one that we didn't talk about backstage. But how do you think some of these kind of memories and experiences, because you both talked about things from your early childhood, how do you think those kind of experiences set you on a path, if they did, or maybe there was another kind of formative moment when you realized, wow, this food is really important to me, and maybe this is something I really want to dedicate my life to. It's like helping people, experience these same kind of, build these own, their own kind of memories like this.
You go first. No, you go ahead.
Well, I think, we're genetically and biologically wired to have food memories. Our hippocampus actually registers food memories as a part of survival. So food memories are kind of the language of survival. We need to eat to survive. And I think, we note when things are either delicious or sustainable or make us feel like we're going to live, But so much more than that, it also speaks to the belonging of a place, of a people, of a family. And for me, the memories of being in India are in one compartment. We moved to the Bronx when I was 8.5, and my mom was pretty traumatized by the move, and I, now realize why. She was a survivor of the partition from Pakistan to India, and she was my age when that partition happened. My age when I was 8.5, I moved, and she was 8.5 when that happened, and she lost her parents on a train in front of her in a massive slaughter, as was in 1947 happening almost daily. And, when we moved to America, I think, anytime she was displaced, voluntarily or not, it really, was a trigger for her. Now we know the language of trauma, and trigger is something like the kids use all the time. But, when she was standing over a stove and cutting the onions into the pot with her hands, we didn't use a cutting board. I think everybody can kind of relate to that, Southern Indian or whatever. Those were the times when she would talk about her memories as a child. And she was an incredible cook, but nobody ever taught her. She just had this language of food embedded in her DNA, and I think maybe that experience of being displaced permanently, never being able to go back to her childhood home, losing her parents and having, 8 other siblings who kind of, she was third from youngest of 9 children. The rest of them had already moved out, and they were older and already kind of settled. there wasn't this like very warm family, it just happened to be not a very warm, close family. So I think she was constantly trying to recreate these flavors of her childhood, of a time when things weren't so bloody. And her food was kind of grown from her heart. It was grown from her memories. And being in America, like, she made a conscious decision to be the person that made sure that we had a family meal every night that was homemade. So when she started working a year and a half in, I became her designated ambassador of that sustenance. And so it was a very long process and a long and complicated relationship that I had with her food. And I never thought of having a career in food. I didn't think that was an option that was available to me. We're an immigrant family. I was expected to go to graduate school and have more letters attached to the back of my name. But as life had it, it was a winding story. And it became incredibly evident to me that life was leading me to be a cook and to understand the role of storytelling through food for me personally. And her food was sort of the springboard for opening a restaurant, but then I realized that there's so much more. There's so many stories to tell in food, and I became more rooted in this place. And so using these ingredients and tying the stories of the world together are endlessly inspiring to me.
Wow. So, for reasons I cannot explain, even as a very young child, I tended to notice that what people ate was a reflection of opportunity, exclusion, and priorities. And I think that we're all imprinted on our earliest foods. Not just earliest foods, but often the very first time we ate something, the very best time we had it, and the very worst time we had it. And that we often use that as a baseline for food experiences the rest of our life. And I, for some reason, just like I said, figured that out at a pretty early age. I wrote my first recipe down on a sheet of paper, drew a picture of it, wrote a story about it, and mailed it to a TV show when I was 4. But it was never my goal to be a cook or a food writer or any of this. My goal was to be a college professor, beloved, of course, who wrote massively successful fiction in the off season. None of that never happened, but what I did realize is that when a writing project goes well, or a cooking class goes well, or an episode of the show goes well, it's not that people figure out what I think about a food or a food memory or a cultural touchstone that maybe an ingredient has, is that they start thinking about what they think about it. Because I believe with all my heart that each of us has earned and deserves our food stories, and that they're very often overlooked as being not as important as our music or our art or as our buildings or architecture, but they are accidental archives, very intimate accidental archives on who we are as individuals and part of a family and part of a community and part of a culture. And I just think that that's worth celebrating. I think each of us needs to lift up a personal plate of truth.
Ooh, personal plate of truth. That'll stick in my mind. I love that. That's beautiful. And, kind of following up on that, Sheri, we were talking backstage about how this is a literary festival, though it's much more, because I think one of the things that's really lovely about JLF is how, it ties in visual arts and performing arts and food. But, thinking about the written form, you started talking about this recipe you wrote at age 4, but do y'all have a particular philosophy about recipes, about collecting them, about passing them along? How do you think? Like, are you very faithful to recipes? Do you like to improvise? How do you feel about recipes? Tell us about that.
Well. I have personally written 16 cookbooks, but I've probably ghostwritten and or collaborated and or coached another 50 or 60 maybe. So there's two parts of me. As a professional, I have a very rigorous approach to recipes, much like writing a lab report. The body of a recipe, the weights, the measures, the method do in writing, because you're trying to convey that information in a way that you hope someone else can follow, faithfully for inspiration or to the letter or whatever. But where the art comes in, the literature of a recipe is what we call the head note, or the story that goes around it that gives it context and color. They are the things that you would tell someone if you were standing there trying to tell them about your dish in the moment. So I write recipes. I write several dozen a year, some years several hundred, but I don't cook with them, because I write recipes with my brain, but I stir the pot with my heart. So I think both of those things are important.
I can relate so deeply to that. I was thinking about this when we talked about it earlier. As a chef who owns a restaurant, my primary goal is to serve the guest. And if we're fortunate enough to have somebody come over and over again, they expect consistency. And consistency is really the hardest thing to provide in a restaurant where you're, working with a team of people who have different levels of experience, different levels of giving a bleep, and different relationships to food. And you compound that with, an evolving ingredient list. Nature changes. Tomatoes are different in June than they are in August, and sometimes things don't come in. So there's a certain level of improvisation that you have to be skilled at. But the more I do this, the more I realize that I'm like our recipe book is always growing, and it's a 3-ring binder that goes from 2 inches last year to 3.5 inches this year, and more I do everything in grams. It's very meticulous, but so there's a mechanical aspect to production and to the consistency, and that involves skill and intuition. But there's an ephemeral role of memory and cooking. And it's interesting that you say you stir with your heart. Like, I think most of the non-royal traditions of food are folklore. They're all oral traditions, and they're all recipes that are passed down from grandmas and aunties to people. And we evolve them based on our experiences. We always know these things by heart. And they're often not written down. My grandmother on my dad's side couldn't read or write, and she wasn't a particularly great cook, but she left an indelible mark in my heart. So going from mechanical to ephemeral, it's kind of like being a good musician. You got to know your scales, you got to know how to move your fingers, but you can't be a jazz improv player unless you can play the basics. You got to know your blues, you got to know your classical, and you have to go through that discipline of repetition and knowing when to taste and how to change and how to fix and all of those things. So I think having a backbone and a structure is so important, but then being able to dance with your food and listen to it and ask it what it needs. But I personally have read cookbooks like novels. I don't ever really open up a cookbook and prop it up on the counter and follow it unless I'm cooking at the restaurant. Then it's my recipe that I've forgotten. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. We do this because, so-and-so's not going to know how to do whatever, idiot-proofing a lot of things. But yeah, I think recipes really tell a story, and they're maps, and you can follow them if you want to end up in the same place every time, or you can meander if you want to be lost on purpose.
If I could add one thing, I want everyone to write down the recipe, and I don't mean literally write. You can if that's your gift, but make a little video, jot something down on the back of an envelope. But the point of a family recipe in particular is to not let a taste memory go extinct. Because if the last person that knew firsthand how something tasted or smelled or looked or whatever is gone, that part of who you are and who everyone who led to you is gone. So we need to jot down our food memories.
I think, yeah, that's... I do want to add that I don't know if this is an Indian thing in particular, but none of our aunties or our moms give you a recipe. They say, how much jeera, how much cumin, and they say the right amount. Come on, what a dumb question. So I think jotting down was the first thing I did when I was thinking about opening Garland, and my mom gave me recipes, and then I tested them, and I was like, she has no idea how many tablespoons are in a cup. Like, she really has no idea.
The best recipe, because I collect cookbooks, I do it for archives, for other things, and my own and so forth, and I'll tell you the best recipe I ever saw said, fix your beans the way that Nell Coffee fixes hers, and then from there, do what you think is best.
Amazing. How many cookbooks in the collection, Sheri, if you had to guess?
I've let it creep back up to 1,800. Yeah, it was a lot more there for a little while, yeah.
That's incredible. That's incredible. I wanted to follow up because we started talking about restaurants a little bit, and just out of curiosity, how many people have been to Ajja? We need to see more hands up, y'all. I mean, some are being raised very high, and that's really appropriate. Or Garland, have you been? How many folks? Okay, cool. Well, I see some people there who have very much a to-do that you should know that you need to go because you've been to Garland. So, of course, as was mentioned when Sri did the introduction, Cheetie's an extremely successful and award-winning restaurateur, and Sheri is no stranger to restaurants. And since we're talking about memory, just wanted to hear. We were talking about how restaurants are this really important third place, some place that's neither home nor work, where we forge, not only have amazing meals, but we forge really important social bonds. How does the environment in a great restaurant contribute to memory making?
That's a great question. I think we're in the business of making memories, but I think, the most successful visit that somebody can have to a restaurant isn't necessarily about how much money they spend, but my favorite thing, and when I opened Garland, when we opened Garland in 2013, I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't have any formal training. I didn't have a resume that, I didn't come from a chef who was a mentor. I was just kind of jumping in 2 feet first. And it was a hard sell, to be in downtown Raleigh, a small southern town, and be talking about, global food and the connection of Asia, and, not including China, not having sushi, not having buttered chicken, not having a buffet, sourcing locally, talking about, I wanted to talk it like cuminism is how I wanted to describe it on Facebook, but that didn't have a category. So, in 13 years and 14 years, it's evolved quite a bit, but my favorite thing was people would come in and say, and I also was like, I really want to call things what they were. I was very influenced by Mateo and Durham would always use the Spanish words, and it's like everybody has Google on their phone, so look it up. But people would say I was intimidated. I looked at this menu and there were all these words I didn't know, but then I ate this dish and it reminded me of my grandmother. And this is somebody who's from, Johnson County, North Carolina, or South, wherever, Georgia. And it really made me feel like it was so affirming. And it really made me feel like, yes, we are all connected. And maybe that's like an immigrant, goal is to really tie everyone together. We are always kind of being divided, but I think we all want to kind of go back home. We all want to understand what threads us together, and just because it's a skewer of chicken that's been in a tandoor and it goes, with a flatbread and a bunch of pickles. I mean, I think that could belong on a meat and three menu or whatever. But there's always these. Maybe it's the intention of the intention by which it was made that makes people feel like they're at home. But that is success in my mind.
I have never worked in a restaurant other than a few shifts where some friends let me pretend I was a restaurateur for a day. But I do help sometimes people that own restaurants write their books. And I always say, what is it that you want the reader to take away from this page? Do you want them to remember when they ate it at your place? Do you want them to try to recreate it at home? Which is foolish, because the one thing that every restaurant has in common, whether it's a drive-through or a gorgeous place like Cheetie's or some fine dining place, is you don't cook a thing. So in some ways, just even writing about restaurant food is interesting. But what I've learned, whether you're writing about restaurant food or other people's home cooking or cooking from other places, is a thing that I call emotional equivalency or emotional analogies. Everyone in here has a favorite food, and it's probably different for each of us. So it doesn't matter what that food is. What matters is that we all know what it feels like to have a favorite food. And sometimes that is what I find will be a thing where I may not know this ingredient or this dish or this place, but I certainly know what it is to feel deep joy or intense regret over what I ordered.
I want to say that there's one more ingredient. I think empathy is such a huge part of hospitality. And you can have good service that's very cold and you don't really feel seen or welcome, but having an empathetic perspective as somebody who is an owner or even your server, or like everybody, between us and the staff with each other, empathy is a very important part of something just feeling a little bit different. It's not cookie cutter. It's not about the light fixtures. It's about how you feel when you're there, and that hopefully you feel seen.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to ask a follow-up to that, because you mentioned Mateo, which I'm a big fan of Mateo as well as Matt's other restaurants, but any particular restaurant experience y'all want to highlight that, especially, do we have some visitors here? We have some people from outside of the Triangle? Cool. So you've got Ajja on your list. We might give you some other places to go to. Any particular restaurant memory, either local or elsewhere, you want to really highlight?
Oh, you're going to have to go first on that one.
I have so many. There's so many here. I mean, Mateo, the first time I went there, when they first opened, was definitely there, and it was before Garland opened, and it was like, I got a lot of permission from that. But I've done a lot of traveling. I used to be in a rock band, and we toured a lot. We toured like dogs for 10 years, and we went to Europe, and there were places in the Basque region, and but I can say high and low. There was a place called Miss Ellen's Soul Food in Memphis, and the first time we went there, we always went back every time we were in Memphis. The first time there was a garbage collectors strike, and I remember where it was off of MLK Boulevard in Memphis, and the trash was piled high on the sidewalks, and Miss Ellen's Soul Food had fried chicken that was cooked in a skillet. It was not a deep fried chicken, and it took like 40 minutes to get to the table. There were Johnny cakes on the table. There was molasses and hot sauce, and this cabbage that had probably way too much sugar, but it was, I still remember it with vinegar, and they just called you sugar and sweetie, and I just loved it so much. It was so delicious, and I still think about that chicken as the best chicken I've ever had. And then there was on the opposite end of the spectrum, I was lucky enough, Paul and I went to Paris with a group of friends, one of them who happens to be very wealthy. She took us to a 3 Michelin star place. And the name has immediately flown out of my head. It's been there since Napoleon. Napoleon ate there, and it was a 4-hour lunch, and by the end of it, we were all crying. It was so good, and I'll be quick about this, but it started with this centerpiece that had like what looked like dragon's eggs in the center, and we were like, "What is that?" And the waiter was like, "You find out at the end of the meal," and. So we ate, we had wine, it was just beautiful. It was 7 of us, I think, and at the end, we were, beaten down with a lot of food and too much wine in the afternoon. They took that centerpiece and they got scissors and they cut it open, and they put sugar on it, they bruleed it, and we all got one, and it smelled like a campfire, and it was, there were passion fruits that had been they put cream in there at the start of the meal, and they put some yogurt culture in there, and the acid from the inside of the passion fruit made yogurt. It was mishti doi or yogurt, whatever you want to call it, and it was just brilliant. And I had just lost my mom, and that smell, just like, oh my God, I was bawling like a little baby. So that was one of the most incredibly indelible memories of my life, for sure, food or otherwise.
Well, I see I need to travel with Cheetie more often. Yeah, that's for sure. There are several local restaurants I like, and if I think about restaurants, even on the traveling I have done, I am deeply impressed when someone can give me a bite of something I have eaten in my entire life in a way that I've never had it before. That reinvention of the familiar will never cease to impress me, that creativity and so forth. And then I also like places, and it can be very large restaurants, or it can be a taco truck, it can be at a friend's house or something, where it is what I call culinary GPS. You take one bite and you know exactly where you are and that you could not be anywhere else. And it's usually cooked by someone that has a gift of confidence, that they are convinced and will convince you that their version is better than anybody else's in the world, until you talk to the next person who makes that a different way, who is convinced that's the best way to make it in the world. I like vernacular cooking, especially when people stand up and holler with their food.
They're both right.
And they're both right. There are exactly. Everybody has the prettiest baby, and every person that cooks their specialty is doing it the best way possible. Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. That's amazing. Man, yeah. We all need to travel more, right? Maybe with Cheetie. Or we could go with Teamwork to India, right? And I'm sure you eat some incredible food there at those 3 festivals. We're here at a university. In our last panel, Soba asked how many writers, aspiring writers we have. And this one I'd like to start with Sheri. But for any emerging writers who are interested in exploring food and memory in their own work, what advice would you offer?
I'm very fortunate that I actually get asked to talk about this quite a bit with writers groups and other universities, and at Carolina, including one day this week. And whether you intend to write a recipe or you just want to have a richer internal dialogue with yourself, richer memories, whatever, is something that I learned at a writer's retreat maybe close to 25 years ago now, and that is every day, or if not every day, at least once a week, when you can, pause in the moment and take in a sensory experience. It can be something you're eating. It can be the way that the sunshine feels, or the rain feels, or the temperature of the air, but some really potent sensory experience, and apply language to it. Don't say the water was wet. Don't say the sun was warm. Use your words, use your words. Churn up adjectives, churn up imagery, and so forth that. And I find that if you do occasionally take the time to truly apply language to something, you're on the way to being a better conversationalist, a better cook, a better human. Human. That's it. Apply language carefully.
Well, I'm one of those people who's exploring, do I have a book in me or not? And it's just a matter, I think, I've been involved in making records and obviously making menus. And I think you're right. I think slowing down is really important, and that's not as a way of life, but finding the ability to recognize when you just need to stop for a minute. It's usually when you think you need to move really fast, and it's a really counterintuitive decision to make. And being connected to the moment, I think, is really important. But then there's so much of it that's just discipline and doing the hard work of going from being inspired to recording it and using your words and writing it down, taking a picture, speaking it into your phone, whatever technique it is. And I think that, understanding techniques and tools are really important. And for me personally, I think limitations are really good. And sometimes I'll artificially impose limitations just to be able to narrowly focus on something and draw it to its natural conclusion or unnatural conclusion. And sometimes, you're on a really stupid path, and I saw this quote the other day from Laurie Anderson, and it just said, sometimes I'm writing a really stupid song, but I'll make sure I finish it just to see what happens, because the more you abandon, the more you stop understanding what it feels like to complete something. And I think completing any thought, completing a sentence, completing a project, completing a recipe or a song, a story, and then you can chisel into shape, but you can't do that unless you produce something.
Well, since she was talking about the mechanics a little more, I feel like I should too, but I have what I call, first of all, being a writer means words do have to go on a page at some point. If you're not, you're just a busy thinker. Okay, you've got to actually get them on a page. And I wrote my entire first book, which was huge, too big actually, walking my dog. Over a course of 3 years, I would put paper and a stubby pencil in my pocket, and every time the dog stopped to do anything, I would have a thought and jot it down. And so it may not all go in this work, even if you're just trying to write a letter to a loved one or write down that one family recipe. But I also keep what I call a word spit bucket, to use a wine tasting thing. Even if it winds up not being what goes in the piece that I am having to write at that time, doesn't mean it's bad. And sometimes just put it down, put it somewhere that it's not lost, and realize that it may not go in what you're working on now, but it doesn't mean it doesn't have form and value. Just get it down, put it in the spit bucket.
Amen.
Well, we'd love to hear what kind of questions you have for our amazing panelists. So I believe we've got, actually we have 2 microphones that are going to be traveling down the aisle. So what would y'all like to hear? I see a hand right over here.
Rock band, restaurant, how did that? Rock band, restaurant, how did that?
He's asking rock band to restaurant, how did that happen? Procrastination maybe? I don't know. I just kind of, I went from managing bands, and I had a company when I was like in my early 20s, and I was managing 3 or 4 bands. They all got great record deals, and then they all broke up. And then I had no company anymore. And I had just met Paul, and we started playing music together. I didn't think that was a thing, and I basically did it as a procrastination exercise to figure out what my next step was, and then that became the next step. And while we were touring, I was reading cookbooks in the van. I was catering a little bit. I was working at a restaurant to make money while I was a starving musician, and we just had an opportunity. We signed a lease, and then I became a restaurant owner, and you realize that I had to learn how to be a chef, which is very different than being a cook. Being a chef is a whole other set of skills, discipline again, and organization and stress management. A lot of math.
Who's next? Oh, all right, why don't we go over here and then...
Sorry. Now it is.
Wonderful discussion. We've been to your restaurant, Cheetie, and just absolutely love it because there's just different flavors that you incorporate in your dishes.
Thank you.
How much time do you spend experimenting? My husband and I love cuisines from all over the world, and he drives me crazy because the kitchen's always a mess with all sorts of mixes. So just curious, what kind of time frame, do you give up at certain points and say this combination is not going to work?
It happens all the time. I R&D constantly. Our kitchen now is really small at the restaurant, and I have to wait till service starts. So I'm present during service, but I'm like, I have, a table, like the end of a table to R&D on, a little induction burner, my tools, and it's a good limitation. I think, just working on stuff is so important, and it helps me be more fluent. A lot of times things don't work out, but again, I put them in the spit bucket and it comes back. Sometimes it's a good idea, but it's not realistic, or it just doesn't really doesn't end up, sometimes you think mint will work on something and it doesn't, and then sometimes a dish is almost there and mint just saves the day and it puts it over the top. You just don't know until you try it, so you really have to just do the mechanical work of making it happen, being organized. I'll set myself up the day before. I need to work on something when I know that I have to put something on the menu in 3 days or so because, watermelon's gone, so you got to get beets going. Like, it's nature's always giving me a deadline. Yeah, but
But he also can load the dishwasher,
yeah,
okay?
and he can also label things. Spice mixes do expire, so yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. A question of mine of food as food from the past and also food in the future. So we talked about preserving memories and maybe writing down familial recipes. However, just because it's written down and we have the measurements doesn't mean it will taste the same as like when a grandmother made it. So thinking about how do we make peace with that and still preserve it, but also food for the future of thoughts on how do we create new recipes or new traditions with our what we're going through in our family or what our current life is for future generations or just people in the family.
Yeah, go ahead. You go.
That's a whole conversation. We're all, so many of us are from India originally in our genes, but we live here now. And I think, a lot of times we don't even know if it's possible to recreate something that was cooked by somebody's hands that you love, admire, that was your elder in your family. Maybe it's not possible. Maybe, the oil, the salt, the cilantro, the onions, the carrots, they're different. They just taste different. You'll never really be able to get to that, but that's okay because in that quest to recreate, you create something new, and now you're doing it for the next generation or for somebody else. And I think, that's a story that's always evolving. And it's, I think having that unrequited feeling keeps us going. I think it's a bittersweet kind of exercise. Short answer to a very complex topic.
Sometimes it's not possible to recreate a recipe because the person who made that from us is not making it. It's like people will travel and say, well, I went to, Croatia and came back and it didn't taste the same. You're not in Croatia anymore. Sometimes there is some things that don't translate. But even if a person or a family or a community didn't have reason because of displacement or economic influences or climate change or whatever to inherit something, you always are at liberty to start something. And I don't want us to undervalue that. You're always at liberty to start a new tradition that matters to you.
What a lovely note to end on, right?
Beautiful. Thank you so much.